She was born into palaces, surrounded by jewels and titles, yet she carried a secret that set her apart from every expectation of royal life. Princess Alice of Battenberg, the great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, was not only a royal by blood, but also a woman who defied the very idea of what royalty was supposed to mean. Born deaf in the late 19th century, she began life already misunderstood by those closest to her. What most saw as a limitation became the beginning of an extraordinary journey that shaped her into one of the most remarkable, yet little-known figures in modern history. Her story is not one of endless privilege. Instead, it is a tale of exile, loss, and a search for purpose beyond palaces and ceremonies. She married into the turbulent world of Greek royalty, faced multiple exiles, endured the collapse of her marriage, and battled personal struggles with mental health. Yet from these trials emerged a woman of astonishing resilience and compassion. While most royals were bound by tradition, Alice chose service. She founded a nursing order, lived in simplicity, and during the dark years of World War II risked her own safety to shelter Jewish families from the Gestapo in Nazi-occupied Athens. Decades later, the world would finally recognize her as righteous among the nations, a title reserved for those who showed extraordinary courage during the Holocaust. But long before honors came, Alice lived her truth quietly, leaving behind a legacy that still inspires today. She reminds us that real nobility is not about crowns or titles, but about sacrifice, resilience, and selfless devotion to others. Welcome to Words of Time. In this video, we uncover the extraordinary life of Princess Alice of Battenberg, a royal unlike any other, whose story of strength, faith, and humanity deserves to be remembered. Princess Alice of Battenberg was born in the year 1885, a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria, into a world where royal bloodlines defined identity, position, and expectations. Yet, even at her very first breath, her story would unfold in ways that marked her as unlike the usual princesses of Europe. She was not destined to be a mere ornament of the court, draped in silks and guided by strict tradition. She was born deaf, a condition that made her stand apart from the assumptions and customs of aristocracy, a class that valued polished appearances, fluent conversation, and public charm. From that single fact, her inability to hear, sprang an entire life that would never truly fit into the narrow mold prescribed for daughters of noble families. The House of Battenberg, into which Alice was born, was not one of the most powerful ruling dynasties in Europe, but it was quietly influential, with threads tying it to many thrones across the continent. The Battenbergs were a branch of the German House of Hesse, connected by marriage to the British royal family through Queen Victoria herself. This interwoven heritage meant that Alice grew up surrounded by relatives who wore crowns in different lands, each ruling in their own manner, while also navigating the complicated political tides of late 19th century Europe. To the casual observer, the Battenbergs might not have seemed as commanding as the Romanovs in Russia or the Habsburgs in Austria, but their marriages and alliances placed them near the center of the European stage. This gave Alice a position of status, privilege, and recognition. Yet it also meant that the contrast between what her family expected and what her own personal limitations allowed was all the sharper. From the earliest years, her deafness posed challenges not only for her communication, but also for the ways she was viewed by others. In aristocratic circles, much of the display of wit and intelligence occurred in drawing rooms, salons, and at grand dinners, where sparkling conversation was the currency of the elite. For a child unable to hear those exchanges, the sense of separation was immediate and enduring. However, Alice's situation forced her to develop alternative ways of understanding the world. She learned to lip read, to pay keen attention to facial expressions, and to cultivate a heightened sense of observation that most others never needed to acquire. What seemed at first a disadvantage became, in time, a distinctive way of engaging with people and events. She could not participate in the chatter of banquets, but she noticed subtleties of gesture, tone, and movement that others overlooked. This dual reality, being both within the royal sphere yet also on its margins, was central to her identity. Many princesses of her era were educated to become suitable brides, expected to marry well, and to reinforce alliances. Their accomplishments were measured in charm, obedience, and cultural refinement. Alice, however, was already set apart. The combination of her royal birth and her deafness meant that she could not easily be reduced to a stereotype. Those around her may have thought she was less suited for the stage of public life, but in truth, her difference was what gave her depth. It created a foundation of resilience and adaptability that would define her in later years. The late 19th century was a period in which the map of Europe seemed both deeply entangled and dangerously fragile. Families like the Battenbergs were constantly navigating ties of loyalty and suspicion, as kingdoms shifted and political winds blew unpredictably. Alice's place in this puzzle was complicated. Through her great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, she had links to Britain, where she spent much of her youth. Through her German roots, she was tied to continental dynasties. This web of connection gave her an unusual perspective, even as a child. She could see that royalty was not only about crowns and processions, but also about the burden of heritage and the constant balance between tradition and adaptation. To understand why Alice's early experiences were so formative, it helps to consider what it meant to be a deaf child in a hearing world during that era. Medicine in the late 19th century had little understanding of such conditions, and the dominant cultural view was often one of pity or limitation. Yet, rather than being confined by silence, Alice cultivated an inner strength. She learned that understanding did not always come from words spoken aloud. It came from watching, from interpreting, from sensing the unspoken. She had to work harder to catch what others grasped without effort, and this sharpened her mind. Her family recognized both the challenge and the uniqueness of her condition. She was given tutors and support, and she applied herself with determination. Unlike many children of her class who could take their education for granted, Alice's learning was not simply handed to her. She had to struggle, to adapt lessons to her own way of processing information, and to overcome the frustration of a world that often assumed she was less capable. This constant exercise of willpower instilled in her a tenacity rare even among the most accomplished royals. The irony of Alice's situation was that while aristocratic life often emphasized form over substance, her condition forced her to focus on substance over form. In ballrooms, her inability to hear the music meant she might not dance with the same ease as others, but she absorbed the mood, the atmosphere, the undercurrents that animated the room. While her cousins and contemporaries perfected small talk, she relied on observation to detect what lay beneath the surface. This created in her a sensitivity to people, a sense of empathy and attention that would later become central to her life's work. The Battenbergs themselves often found their role described as lesser, but their influence stretched wide. They were bridge builders, a family that could move across boundaries. Their position was not about commanding empires, but about connecting them. For Alice, this atmosphere of quiet but strategic influence reinforced her awareness of complexity. Life was not simple, and neither were identities. She was both British and German, both royal and marginal, both privileged and challenged. Such dualities shaped her character far more than any ceremony or courtly ritual. In those early years, as she grew into girlhood and then adolescence, the contrast between expectations and reality deepened. Other princesses were groomed for specific marriages and roles. Alice, while still part of that system, was beginning to carve her own path, though she may not have realized it fully at the time. Her uniqueness meant that she was less likely to be confined to the shallow roles others played. She carried with her the awareness that difference was not a weakness, but a different way of engaging with life. The Europe of her youth was still confident, still draped in the illusion of stability. No one yet knew the cataclysms that the 20th century would bring. Yet in Alice's own life, the seeds of resilience were already planted. She was learning to interpret silence, to transform difficulty into perspective, to balance between worlds. Her lineage gave her grandeur, but her condition gave her depth. Together, they prepared her for a life far removed from the easy assumptions of palace walls. When one looks back on the story of Princess Alice, it becomes clear that her childhood and youth were not a prologue but a foundation. The way she adapted to her deafness, the way she observed the intricate interplay of her family's place in Europe, and the way she grew up both inside and outside aristocratic norms shaped everything that came after. She would never be a conventional princess. Her destiny was to walk a road marked by complexity, service, and compassion, born from the unique position of being a royal who could not hear yet who, in a deeper sense, always listened more closely than most. Her story is an enigma not because it is unclear, but because it challenges assumptions. A deaf princess in a world of speeches and ceremonies, a member of a lesser royal house with connections that spanned nations, a woman who from childhood lived in both silence and insight. These are the contradictions that make her remarkable. And it was in those contradictions, formed in the earliest chapters of her life, that the outlines of her extraordinary journey first began to take shape. Princess Alice's life cannot be understood as a straight line of events, but rather as a constant negotiation between what was expected of her and what she could realistically offer to the role she was born into. From the very beginning, her deafness created a reality that was impossible to ignore. In the world of royalty, where appearances, conversation, and social presence meant almost everything, she grew up in an environment that both privileged her with grandeur and excluded her at the same time. This duality shaped her character in ways that would become more apparent as she moved from childhood into adulthood. Though she was given every advantage that her station could provide, tutors, travel, and connections across Europe, her condition always made her upbringing deeply unconventional. At a time when medicine offered little understanding of deafness, people often mistook her silence for indifference or a lack of intelligence. Society carried with it a host of misconceptions, and aristocratic circles were no exception. To those who did not know her well, the absence of lively verbal participation was too easily read as a deficiency. Yet to those who took the time to truly engage with her, it was clear that she was not only intelligent but also unusually perceptive. Her way of communicating was not simple, and it demanded patience both from herself and from those around her. Lip reading required her to study people's mouths, their expressions, their movements. Misunderstandings were common, and frustration was inevitable, but Alice did not retreat into despair. She pressed forward with determination, even when the effort left her exhausted. She developed her own systems, gestures, and subtle cues to fill in the gaps, carving out her place in conversations that might otherwise have left her behind. While most royals could take for granted that they would be understood, Alice had to work constantly to earn that understanding. This struggle honed a resilience that became one of the defining traits of her personality. In the courts of Europe, where wit and charm were as much a currency as titles and estates, Alice could not rely on the same social tools as others of her rank. Yet this very challenge forced her to rely on strengths that were inward rather than outward. She was less concerned with dazzling an audience and more concerned with genuinely perceiving those around her. Over time, this cultivated a rare sensitivity. She did not need to dominate conversation to know the heart of a matter. She learned to sense moods, to recognize unspoken tensions, to read what others overlooked. That kind of perception cannot be taught in schools or instilled by etiquette masters. It is a skill forged only through necessity. For many in her position, royal life was a script already written. Daughters of noble houses were expected to embody grace, to marry well, and to serve as living symbols of dynastic continuity. They were dressed, trained, and directed with precision, as if they were pieces on a chessboard. Alice, however, was always slightly outside that script. Her deafness made it impossible for her to glide effortlessly into the role of the perfect princess. Instead, she carried with her the constant reminder that she did not fully belong to the world around her. Rather than crushing her spirit, this outsider status gave her an unusual freedom. If she could never fully meet the rigid expectations placed upon her, then she was at liberty to redefine what her path could be. The effort to integrate into aristocratic circles was not without its costs. There were moments of isolation, moments when she must have wondered if she would ever truly be accepted. The easy laughter of drawing rooms, the quick exchange of remarks across dinner tables, the music that filled grand halls. These were experiences she could only partly access. Yet it was precisely through these exclusions that her independence of thought grew. While others lived inside the constant noise of courtly chatter, Alice spent much of her life in quiet observation. She saw how often words were shallow, how frequently appearances were deceptive, how quickly fortunes rose and fell in the game of power. The silence that separated her from others also protected her from being absorbed entirely into the superficialities of royal life. Her resilience was not built overnight, nor was it the product of a single defining moment. It grew out of 1,000 small struggles. The effort to follow a conversation in multiple languages, the persistence required to be taken seriously by tutors, the patience demanded when people underestimated her again and again. Each of these difficulties, while painful in the moment, contributed to the forging of a character that was anything but fragile. Alice came to embody a quiet strength, a kind of endurance that would later prepare her for trials far more severe than those of childhood or adolescence. The differences between her and other royals became even more pronounced as she reached maturity. While her peers often accepted their roles without question, Alice's early challenges had already set her on a course of questioning, reflection, and search for meaning. She was not content merely to be an ornament of the court. She was not satisfied to exist as a figure defined only by lineage. Instead, she began to look inward, seeking to understand her purpose beyond the shallow labels of birthright. This search, though still faint in her early years, grew stronger with time. It is tempting to imagine that her deafness was nothing more than a limitation that she overcame, but this would be too simple a view. Rather, her deafness was a constant companion that shaped her very way of being. It did not merely close doors, it opened others. It made her attuned to silence, to nuance, to the layers of meaning beneath what people said. It made her less dependent on external approval and more grounded in her own sense of perception. It forced her to step outside of the ready-made path and to carve one of her own. This early formation, so unlike the carefully polished upbringing of other princesses, prepared her for something much greater than ceremonial duties. It nurtured in her a spirit of independence and an openness to deeper questions about life, faith, and service. While other royals of her time were schooled in the art of appearances, Alice was already being trained by circumstance to look for substance. Her struggles were not wasted. They became the soil from which a profound and unconventional purpose would later grow. Thus, when we consider her early years and the unseen battles she fought, we begin to understand why her later life unfolded as it did. The seeds of resilience, the independence of mind, and the search for meaning that defined her adult journey were all planted in those formative years. She may have been a royal by birth, but it was her difference that shaped her destiny. In silence, she learned to listen more deeply than those who could hear. In exclusion, she discovered the freedom to think beyond the narrow frame of courtly life. In the struggle for integration, she found the strength to walk her own path. Her story, at this stage, is less about the crown she wore and more about the unseen foundations being laid beneath it. She was, even then, an enigma, part of the world of palaces and dynasties, yet already reaching beyond it. What would come next in her life cannot be understood apart from this early formation, for it was these very struggles that steered her toward a lifelong quest for deeper meaning, a quest that would lead her far beyond the expectations of a princess and into the realm of service, sacrifice, and spiritual devotion. Marriage, for many royals of Alice's generation, was less about personal choice and more about dynastic arrangement. Princess Alice of Battenberg, having grown up in the shadows of both privilege and exclusion, entered into her marriage with Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark with expectations that it would root her within the traditions of European aristocracy. On the surface, the union appeared conventional. Prince Andrew was a member of the Greek royal family, a naval officer, and a man whose lineage was tied, like hers, to the great web of monarchies across the continent. For Alice, it seemed at first to be the fulfillment of what her upbringing had prepared her for, a partnership that linked families, cemented alliances, and carried her into a life that outwardly resembled the pattern of countless other princesses. Yet, as her life had already proven, nothing about her path would remain conventional for long. The marriage, though solemnized in splendor, ushered her into a Greece that was politically volatile, a nation where monarchy was precarious and loyalties could shift almost overnight. In those early years of the 20th century, Greece struggled with its own identity, caught between tradition, modern reform, and the ongoing instability of the Balkans. To be part of the Greek royal family was to live within a storm, and Alice soon discovered that her new life would involve upheavals that few princesses were forced to endure. As a wife and later a mother, she embraced her duties with sincerity. She bore 5 children, among them Prince Philip, who would one day become consort to Queen Elizabeth of Britain. The household she created in Greece was filled with the ordinary rhythms of family life, yet always overshadowed by the larger crises of the nation. Wars, political instability, and the fragile place of the monarchy ensured that security was never guaranteed. Unlike other royals who could depend upon their courts as steady foundations, Alice and her husband often found themselves at the mercy of forces beyond their control. The early part of their marriage coincided with Greece's involvement in a series of military conflicts. Prince Andrew, being a military officer, was directly entangled in these struggles. Alice, in turn, had to endure the fear and anxiety that came with waiting for news, never certain whether safety would hold. This constant instability placed enormous pressure on their relationship and their family. Exile became an all too familiar reality. On more than one occasion, the Greek royal family was forced to flee the country, taking only what they could carry, uncertain if they would ever return. Such experiences were devastating, stripping away the illusions of permanence that most royals could take for granted. The strain was not only external, but also internal. Alice's marriage to Prince Andrew, though built on duty and alliance, was not immune to the emotional toll of dislocation, loss, and frustration. Over time, their bond weakened. The unraveling of their relationship was not sudden but gradual, worn down by years of separation, political defeats, and personal disillusionment. By the 1920s, their marriage was effectively fractured, and though they remained bound by title and children, the emotional closeness that might have sustained them was gone. For Alice, these years were marked by profound personal tragedies. She not only endured repeated displacements and the unraveling of her marriage, but she also faced the erosion of certainty in nearly every sphere of her life. What had once seemed like a clear royal role, wife, mother, princess, was stripped away piece by piece. This stripping away, however painful, also opened a door to something else. Where others might have clung to status or retreated into bitterness, Alice began, slowly and quietly, to look beyond the confines of traditional royal duty. Her deafness, which had already shaped her into a figure of resilience, gave her a perspective that helped her endure the dislocations of exile. She had never lived in a world that accepted her fully. She had always been on the edges of aristocratic life. Now, as exile and separation placed her further from the heart of power, she found herself strangely prepared for it. The silence that had accompanied her since childhood was joined now by the silence of displacement, the absence of a secure home, and the fading of marital companionship. Yet within that silence, she began to sense the outlines of a new path. Withdrawal from conventional royal duties was not a dramatic gesture, but a gradual process. Alice never declared herself free from monarchy, nor did she rebel in a visible way. Instead, she retreated into a quieter existence, increasingly detached from the ceremonies and expectations that had once defined her life. The unraveling of her marriage only deepened this turn inward. Without the full partnership of her husband, and without the security of a stable royal household, she began to look elsewhere for meaning. This period of intense personal struggle was, in many ways, a crucible. It burned away illusions, leaving behind the essence of a woman who no longer identified herself primarily through her crown. While the tragedies she faced could have crushed her, they instead pushed her towards something greater. The hardships of exile, the grief of marital collapse, and the repeated losses of home and certainty drove her to reconsider her role entirely. She was no longer content to be defined only by lineage or expectation. Her gaze shifted toward questions of purpose, service, and faith. It is in this moment of transition that we begin to see how Alice's life would diverge dramatically from the paths of most royals. Other princesses who faced exile or difficulty often sought comfort in a return to aristocratic circles, in the safety of relatives or the glitter of court life elsewhere. Alice, however, had lived too long on the margins of those worlds to find true refuge there. She understood, in a way few others did, that appearances were fragile and that meaning lay elsewhere. Her early struggles with deafness had taught her endurance. Her marriage and its unraveling had taught her loss. Now, both endurance and loss combined to prepare her for a future defined not by ceremonial crowns, but by a life of service. The path before her was still unclear in those years, but the direction had already begun to take shape. She was not retreating into obscurity. She was reorienting herself towards something larger than the courts of Europe. In leaving behind the conventional duties of royalty, she was moving slowly but surely toward a new identity, one that would redefine her legacy. She would come to be remembered not for her place in the line of succession or for the titles she held, but for the compassion, resilience, and dedication that grew out of these years of struggle. The tragedies of her middle years, the exiles, the breakdown of her marriage, the repeated loss of security, were not the end of her story. They were the painful but necessary stages of transformation. Through them, Alice discovered that the crown was not her true calling. Her legacy would not rest on the fragile foundations of monarchy, but on the deeper, more enduring values of service, sacrifice, and spiritual purpose. And so, even as the early 20th century raged with wars, revolutions, and collapsing empires, Alice of Battenberg was undergoing a quieter revolution of her own. She was becoming something rare, a royal who found her greatest strength not in the privileges of birth, but in the strength born from suffering. The next chapter of her life would reveal just how far she would go in that search, and how profoundly her unconventional path would reshape her place in history. By the time Princess Alice began to withdraw from the expectations of conventional royalty, the contours of her new identity were still only faintly visible. The exile from Greece, the unraveling of her marriage, and the repeated losses that had forced her to reassess her place in the world had left her vulnerable, but also strangely free. She no longer carried the burden of sustaining appearances for the sake of a fragile monarchy, nor did she cling to the illusion that status alone could provide stability. What she carried instead was a deep sense of searching, a need to discover meaning beyond the ceremonial world into which she had been born. In the 1930s, that search took a remarkable and unexpected turn. Alice, having long been influenced by her faith, began to move steadily toward a life defined not by courtly obligations, but by spiritual devotion. She found in the teachings and practices of Orthodox Christianity something that resonated with her own life of silence, endurance, and reflection. She was drawn not to the ritualistic grandeur of religion, which mirrored too closely the superficial glitter of monarchy, but to the quieter and more demanding call of service. It was in these years that she founded the Christian Sisterhood of Martha and Mary, an order of nursing sisters whose mission was to serve the sick and the poor. The idea was extraordinary for a woman of her rank. Instead of devoting herself to leisure, patronage, or the safe comforts of family connections, she chose to create a community of women dedicated to practical acts of compassion. The name itself, invoking the biblical sisters Martha and Mary, reflected the dual call of service and devotion. Martha representing action, Mary representing contemplation. For Alice, the order became a way to weave both strands together. The sisterhood was not vast, nor did it become a globally recognized institution like some religious orders, but it was profound in its intent. Alice poured her energy into organizing care for those who had little. She wore plain clothing, moved among the poor, and set aside the trappings of her royal birth. In doing so, she embodied a form of humility that startled many who knew her as a princess. To be seen in the company of the impoverished was not in itself unusual for members of the aristocracy, since charity had always been part of royal duty. Yet what set Alice apart was the sincerity and depth of her commitment. For her, this was not ceremonial benevolence. It was a vocation. This transition to a life of service might have seemed improbable to outsiders, but in truth it was the natural extension of her earlier struggles. The resilience forged through deafness, the humility born of exile, and the independence cultivated during the breakdown of her marriage had prepared her for this moment. She had learned to endure silence and misunderstanding. She had learned to survive without the comforts of stability. Now she was channeling those lessons into a radical expression of faith and compassion. Where once she had stood on the margins of royal society, she now stood at the heart of human suffering, determined to bring light where there was despair. The outbreak of the Second World War brought her calling into even sharper focus. Greece, once again, was thrust into chaos, occupied by Nazi forces after the fall of Athens in 1941. The presence of the Gestapo and the daily fear of persecution made life dangerous for everyone, and especially for those who were Jewish. In these dark years, Princess Alice revealed a courage that few would have expected from a woman of her station. She sheltered Jewish families in her home, defying the occupying forces and risking her life to protect those who had nowhere else to turn. This act of defiance was not publicized at the time. Alice did not seek recognition, nor did she speak of it afterward with the self-congratulation that sometimes accompanies such deeds. For her, it was a natural extension of her faith and her humanity. She saw people in need, and she responded with protection. The Gestapo questioned her, and she used her deafness as both shield and excuse, pretending not to understand their inquiries. What might have once been seen as a limitation became, in that moment, a tool of survival and resistance. Her silence, long a mark of difference, now became her armor. The courage required to shelter Jewish families in Nazi-occupied Athens cannot be overstated. Discovery would have meant certain death, not only for those she protected, but for herself as well. Yet Alice chose to act anyway. Her royal lineage, far from shielding her, made her more visible and therefore more vulnerable. Still, she placed the needs of others above her own safety. This is the measure of her transformation. The princess who once struggled to find her place in the world of aristocracy now stood as a protector of the voiceless, a guardian of the persecuted. For decades, her heroism remained largely unknown. It was only many years later, long after the war had ended, that the full story came to light. When it did, the world recognized her for what she truly was, not simply a royal consort or the mother of a future prince, but a woman of extraordinary moral courage. In 1993, she was posthumously honored by Yad Vashem as Righteous Among the Nations, an acknowledgement reserved for those who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. For Alice, who had never sought fame or reward, this recognition was a testament to the depth of her compassion. The war years solidified her legacy as something far greater than royalty. She had shown that true nobility is not measured in crowns or titles, but in actions that place humanity above self-preservation. Her choices in those perilous days revealed the essence of her character. Resilience forged through suffering, courage born of silence, and a devotion to service that outshone any ceremonial duty. This was not the life expected of a princess. Few of her contemporaries would have imagined that a woman born into the great web of European monarchies, a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria herself, would one day be remembered not for grand banquets or stately appearances, but for hiding Jewish families in her home under the eyes of the Gestapo. Yet this is precisely what makes her story so extraordinary. She redefined royalty by demonstrating that true greatness lies not in the privileges of birth, but in the willingness to serve, to risk, and to sacrifice. The resilience she displayed through the Second World War was not accidental. It had been cultivated throughout her life, in ways both painful and formative. Her deafness had taught her endurance and patience. Her exile had stripped her of illusions. Her failed marriage had tested her capacity to endure loss. Each of these experiences, far from being obstacles alone, had prepared her for the ultimate test of her humanity, the choice to protect the persecuted when it mattered most. By the time the war ended, Alice had fully stepped into the role she had been moving toward for years. No longer defined by titles or ceremonies, she was now known for her acts of compassion and her unwavering commitment to those who suffered. Her legacy had shifted. She was not remembered simply as the wife of Prince Andrew or the mother of Prince Philip. She was remembered as a woman who had risked her life for strangers, who had founded a nursing order to serve the poor, and who had chosen a path of faith and service over the comforts of royal privilege. Her life of service was not perfect, nor was it free from struggle. She continued to face challenges, including periods of mental health difficulty and the lingering strain of exile. Yet these struggles only underscored her humanity. She was not an untouchable figure removed from the world, but a woman who wrestled with pain, loss, and confusion, and who still chose to act with courage and compassion. What she revealed through her life was that royalty could mean something more than lineage. It could mean responsibility, sacrifice, and love. Her example challenges us to rethink what true nobility looks like. It is not in the glitter of palaces or the security of crowns, but in the willingness to risk everything for the sake of others. Alice's life, especially her actions during the war, stands as proof that the deepest form of royalty is not inherited but lived. In the decades that followed, as Europe rebuilt itself from the devastation of war, Alice continued to embody this spirit of service. Though her later years would bring new challenges, the foundation of her identity had been laid. She was a royal, yes, but more importantly, she was a servant to humanity. Her legacy was not carved in marble or proclaimed in state ceremonies, but written in the lives she touched and the people she saved. This is why, even today, Princess Alice of Battenberg stands apart. Her life was unconventional from the start, defined by difference, exile, loss, and silence. Yet it was precisely through these differences that she discovered the strength to serve in ways few others could. Her story is a reminder that greatness often emerges not from privilege, but from suffering, not from power, but from compassion, not from titles, but from service. She redefined royalty in her own quiet, courageous way, leaving a legacy that speaks more powerfully than any crown. The remarkable acts of service that defined Princess Alice of Battenberg's legacy cannot be fully understood without acknowledging the depth of her personal struggles. Her courage in sheltering the vulnerable during the Second World War and her dedication to the sick and poor through her nursing order were not acts born in ease or comfort. They emerged from a life shaped by hardship, silence, and a series of adversities that would have crushed many others. Perhaps the most misunderstood and painful of these was her struggle with mental health in the 1930s, a period when knowledge of such conditions was limited and compassion was often replaced with stigma. By the time Alice was in her middle years, her life had already been marked by exile, marital strain, and the challenges of raising children in uncertain political climates. Yet it was during this decade that her personal trials took on a new and deeply troubling form. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia, a condition that at the time carried enormous stigma and was little understood either medically or socially. In an era when mental health was rarely spoken of and often cloaked in shame, such a diagnosis was devastating not only for the individual but also for the family. For Alice, whose life had already strayed from the traditional royal script, the experience of being institutionalized for her condition added another layer of complexity to her story. Institutionalization in the 1930s was a harsh reality. Treatments were rudimentary, often experimental, and rarely compassionate by modern standards. Alice found herself confined within clinical walls, separated from her family, and subjected to the opinions of doctors who frequently interpreted spiritual visions and religious devotion as signs of delusion. She had always been deeply spiritual, and in her faith she found solace and purpose. Yet in the context of psychiatric evaluation, these same qualities were often treated as symptoms of illness rather than expressions of devotion. This misinterpretation only deepened the gap between her inner world and the world around her. The stigma was not confined to medical institutions. Within her own family, Alice's condition was met with bewilderment and unease. Royals, who lived under constant public scrutiny, were ill-equipped to handle the vulnerability of mental illness within their ranks. To acknowledge such struggles was to risk scandal. As a result, Alice's institutionalization was both a personal trauma and a source of distance between her and those closest to her. Her husband and children, including her young son Philip, were separated from her during these years. The pain of that separation cannot be overstated. For Alice, already sensitive to exclusion from her earliest days of silence, this enforced absence and misunderstanding cut deeply. Yet, as with so much in her life, Alice transformed this suffering into strength. The years of confinement and the humiliation of being treated as broken could have destroyed her spirit. Instead, she endured, quietly and with a persistence that mirrored the resilience she had already displayed in the face of deafness and exile. She emerged from this period not defeated but renewed, determined to reclaim her independence and to live according to her own convictions. By the time she was released and allowed to resume her life outside of institutional care, she had developed a resilience that would guide her through the remainder of her journey. Her recovery was not a simple matter of being declared well. It was the result of her own determination to redefine herself in spite of the stigma that clung to her name. Against the weight of both societal prejudice and familial hesitation, she carved out a new life. She returned to service, to faith, and to acts of compassion. She resumed her dedication to the vulnerable, proving that her identity would not be confined by medical labels or the limitations others sought to impose upon her. The very act of reclaiming her independence was a form of defiance, a statement that her worth and her calling were greater than the shame that society tried to attach to her condition. What is most extraordinary is the way in which her experience of mental illness deepened her empathy for those on the margins. Having endured misunderstanding, exclusion, and the loss of agency, Alice developed a profound connection to others who were vulnerable. She understood what it meant to be judged unfairly, to be silenced, and to be cast aside. This awareness informed her later acts of service, giving her a compassion that was not theoretical but lived. When she cared for the sick and sheltered the persecuted, she did so not as a distant benefactor, but as someone who had herself felt the weight of despair. Her resilience was not about denying her struggles, but about integrating them into her sense of purpose. The silence of her deafness, the stigma of her mental illness, the exile of her family, and the unraveling of her marriage, all of these formed a tapestry of hardship that could have left her bitter or broken. Instead, they gave her a depth of empathy that few could match. Alice's life became a testament to the idea that suffering, while painful, can also be a source of strength when transformed by compassion. In the years that followed her release, she lived with an unshakable commitment to service. Her acts during the Second World War, her founding of the sisterhood, and her quiet but constant attention to the needs of those who had nothing were all informed by the personal suffering she had endured. She no longer sought validation from the royal circles that had never fully embraced her. Instead, she found validation in the faces of those she served. For Alice, the marginalized were not abstractions. They were mirrors of her own experiences. Her later years continued to bear the marks of this transformation. She dressed simply, lived humbly, and remained close to her faith. She spent time in convents, prayed with intensity, and worked tirelessly for those in need. When she spoke, it was not with the polished rhetoric of court life, but with the sincerity of someone who knew suffering firsthand. The princess who had once been misunderstood by her own family and confined for her mental health became a figure of spiritual authority and moral courage. This resilience, this silent strength, is what sets her apart. In an age when mental illness carried crushing stigma and few paths to recovery, Alice not only endured but also turned her suffering into fuel for her vocation. She demonstrated that strength is not the absence of struggle, but the capacity to rise from it with renewed purpose. Her life challenges the conventional narratives of royalty, offering instead a story of redemption, empathy, and service. The legacy of Princess Alice lies not in her titles or her connections to dynasties, though those remain significant in the pages of history. It lies in the example she set of how adversity can be transformed into compassion. Her deafness made her an observer. Her exile made her resilient. Her failed marriage taught her endurance. Her mental illness gave her empathy. Her acts of service revealed the culmination of these qualities, shaping a woman whose impact extended far beyond the boundaries of royal life. In the end, Alice's story is one of paradoxes. A princess who lived like a servant, a royal who found freedom in humility, a woman misunderstood as fragile who proved unshakably strong. Through silence, through stigma, and through suffering, she discovered a truth that few of her rank ever embraced, that the greatest power lies not in being served but in serving others. The story of Princess Alice of Battenberg, when carried to its end, is not one of loss or obscurity, though she endured both. It is a story of quiet strength that grew into an enduring legacy, one that has continued to ripple outward long after her passing. By the time the world came to recognize the full measure of her life, she had already shaped her legacy through sacrifice, resilience, and devotion. The lessons of her journey lived on not only in her own family, but also in the countless lives she touched, directly or indirectly. Her final years, and the way she has been remembered, bring her life into sharp relief, showing why her example remains relevant today. At the center of her enduring influence was her bond with her youngest child, Prince Philip. He had been only a boy when his family scattered during the turbulence of exile and when his mother was institutionalized. The separation left scars, yet it also shaped his own sense of duty and perseverance. Despite the pain of those years, there was always a connection between mother and son, one that grew stronger as Philip matured and took on the role that would define his life. Husband to Queen Elizabeth of Britain. While Alice never occupied the center of the British monarchy, she quietly influenced it through her example and her relationship with Philip. When Philip married Elizabeth in 1947, Alice was present, dressed in the habit of her religious order rather than the jewels and gowns expected of a royal mother. The sight itself spoke volumes. She was not there as a glittering matriarch, but as a woman who had chosen service and humility. Her simplicity contrasted sharply with the pomp of the occasion, yet it revealed something essential about her. That royalty need not be expressed through opulence, but through authenticity. This lesson was not lost on Philip, who throughout his long life as consort showed a steadfast commitment to service, duty, and resilience in the shadow of the crown. Philip's own understanding of duty bore striking resemblance to his mother's philosophy. He dedicated his life to supporting the monarchy, not as a figure seeking personal glory, but as someone willing to serve quietly and consistently. This ethic, rooted in discipline and endurance, reflected the silent example Alice had set. Though the British royal family often avoided discussion of Alice's mental health struggles and her unconventional path, Philip never forgot what his mother had endured. The resilience he demonstrated, enduring criticism, adapting to shifting roles, and sustaining duty over decades, carried echoes of the resilience she herself had displayed. In her final years, Alice returned to live at Buckingham Palace, spending her last months under the roof of her son and daughter-in-law. To many in Britain, she was an unfamiliar figure, a quiet and elderly woman in religious dress, slipping through the corridors of one of the world's most famous palaces. Yet her presence there symbolized the full circle of her life. She had once been distant from her children through circumstance, and now she ended her journey at the heart of her son's family, still humble, still defined by service rather than grandeur. She died in 1969, leaving behind not great wealth or towering institutions, but a legacy of character. For years after her death, her story remained little known outside narrow circles of historians and royal observers. She was remembered primarily as Prince Philip's mother, a footnote in the larger narrative of Britain's monarchy. But the rediscovery of her wartime courage gradually changed that. When Yad Vashem posthumously recognized her in 1993 as righteous among the nations, the world began to see her not simply as a peripheral royal figure, but as a woman of extraordinary moral courage. That recognition placed her alongside the small but revered group of individuals who, during the Holocaust, risked everything to save Jewish lives. What makes this recognition especially poignant is that Alice never sought credit or public acclaim. She did not write memoirs boasting of her bravery, nor did she ever describe her actions as extraordinary. For her, protecting the vulnerable had been a natural duty, a reflection of her faith and humanity. Yet for the world, finally learning of her deeds decades later, her actions carried immense weight. She had lived a life that redefined what it meant to be royal, shifting the measure from ceremony to service. In August of 2025, as the world reflects on her legacy, her story resonates with renewed power. In an era marked by global uncertainty, inequality, and the constant questioning of traditional institutions, Princess Alice's life offers a reminder that true influence does not come from titles or privilege, but from resilience and compassion. Her recognition as righteous among the nations has become more than an honor. It is a beacon. It highlights how acts of courage, often hidden and uncelebrated at the time, can endure and inspire across generations. Her impact on humanitarian efforts, though less institutional than that of some contemporaries, has been significant. The Christian sisterhood of Martha and Mary may not have grown into a vast global order, but its spirit reflected a model of service that has inspired others. Her example has become a point of reference for faith-based humanitarian work, showing how the blending of devotion and action can create a powerful force for good. And in her wartime defiance, she stands as a reminder of the importance of individual courage in the face of systemic evil. Within the British royal family, her story has taken on renewed meaning in recent years. As the monarchy itself adapts to new times and heightened scrutiny, Alice's legacy offers a model of how service, humility, and humanity can sustain relevance. She did not command armies or shape treaties, but she embodied a kind of quiet strength that remains essential for institutions built on public trust. Her son, her grandsons, and now her great-grandchildren carry forward her influence, often indirectly, through their emphasis on service, charitable engagement, and resilience. The power of her story lies not in grandeur, but in paradox. She was a princess who endured exile, a royal who suffered misunderstanding, a mother separated from her children, a woman diagnosed with schizophrenia and institutionalized in an age that offered little compassion, and yet she rose from all of this to become a figure of faith, service, and extraordinary bravery. Her life dismantles the idea that royalty is synonymous with ease or perfection. Instead, it shows that greatness emerges from struggle transformed into compassion. The rediscovery of her story has brought her out from the margins of history. Documentaries, biographies, and renewed scholarly interest have drawn attention to her acts of courage and her life of service. For many, learning about her for the first time has been revelatory. She is no longer remembered only as Prince Philip's mother, but as Princess Alice herself, a woman who exemplified the highest form of nobility. This matters deeply today, because in every generation there is a temptation to confuse privilege with virtue. Alice's life cuts through that illusion. She shows that titles are empty without character, that crowns are meaningless without compassion, and that history ultimately remembers not those who were most celebrated in their own time, but those who quietly lived with integrity. Her life is evergreen because it speaks to universal truths, that resilience is possible through suffering, that service brings purpose, and that humility can be more powerful than grandeur. As we consider her enduring impact, we see a woman whose silence became strength, whose exile became empathy, and whose struggles became the foundation of service. She shaped her son's understanding of duty, influenced her family's ethos of service, and left behind a humanitarian legacy that continues to inspire. Her recognition as righteous among the nations, especially as it resonates in the summer of 2025, confirms her place not only in royal history but in human history. Princess Alice of Battenberg's life is a reminder that true royalty transcends lineage and privilege. It is found instead in character, resilience, selflessness, and devotion to humanity. She was a princess by birth, but a servant by choice. And it is that choice, repeated again and again through adversity, that makes her story timeless. Her legacy will endure not because she wore a crown, but because she showed the world how to carry suffering with grace, how to live with compassion, and how to redefine royalty for